Happy Monday, everybody. Every Monday I go over my meta review for best of 1, best of 3, and sometimes a budget deck in Standard. And this week I didn't find any budget decks, so we're just going to start things off with the Standard challenges that I like to go over each week to kind of keep an eye on what's happening in best of 3. So just really quickly, I'd like to say thank you to Knighting Lass for becoming a YouTube member and an all-star VIP. Appreciate the support, helping my dreams come true. So first place for the Standard Challenge 32 on May 4th was taken down by Temur Control by Bernastorez. And if we compare this one to the list that made it into the top 8 for the Pro Tour, we can see that it is very similar. So we are seeing the Cabaretti Courtyard being brought in one, and then the Riveteer's Overlook brought down one, and wait, hold up. Oh, sorry about that. For some reason, my brain couldn't see the Fires of Victory, so I wanted to make sure that it was correct. But we saw this brought in for the Pro Tour, and so including the 3 copies of Fires of Victory, which I do think will be kind of a mainstay going forward. As far as the best of 3 sideboard guide, we see minimal change here as well. So we've got the dropping the 1 Colossal Sky Turtle and bringing in 1 copy of a Braid to hate on cards like the Urbrask's Forge in mono red. So also, thank you whoever told me about clicking the sideboard so that it doesn't continuously disappear on me. You have greatly improved my life. Second place was taken down by Esper Midrange by Mestari Matty? Close enough, I hope. And so if we compare this one as well to the Pro Tour list, we do see that there were 2 versions that made it into the top 8 in the Pro Tour, so I'm going to go over the one that didn't have the wedding announcements and the Virtue of Loyalties, so it's the Enchantment list. And compared to that one, we see that they did bring in Dinnik, an additional copy of Dinnik up to 3. They did not bring any copies of Duelist of the Mind. They did bring a 4th copy of Fairy of the Mastermind in, and then as well as a 4th copy of No More Lies. And then as far as the lands go, they're down 1 Caves of Kolios, which is the Orsov Painland, and up a Concealed Courtyard, which is the Orsov Fastland that we got in Outlaws. And then bringing in 1 additional island and cutting 1 Rafine's Tower. So not a huge amount changed, although I'm kind of curious to see the Duelist of the Mind not in there, because I thought that synergized very well with Rafine. But as far as the sideboard goes, they've ditched the 1 copy of Lorn of the Third Path, which is good for the enchantment hate. Kind of makes sense if we're going to see less enchantments in the meta, especially for Esper Midrange. Which still is the most common matchup in the Standard Challenge tournament scene. And then ditching 1 copy of Shrouded Shepherd, which was being explored for Boros Convoke. And then 1 copy of Blotout, which I think was brought in to answer Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal, because it exiles the creature with highest mana value. And instead, we're bringing in an additional copy of Destroy Evil, which was a classic tech against Wedding Announcement and Virtue of Loyalty. Curious to see if Destroy Evil... Oh, and it hits Rafine. But curious to see if we end up seeing less Destroy Evils going forward. Hard to say. It does still hit the enchantments in Boros Convoke. And taking out 1 Disdainful Stroke, so just down to 1 copy there. And we've got... took out the 1 copy of Knockout Blow, and brought in 2 copies of Pest Control. And this one, if you do have access to black, I think is probably preferable to the Temporary Lockdown, because if they don't have any good targets, you can cycle it for 2 colorless and just draw. And then we're bringing in 1 copy of Tishana's Tidebinder in the sideboard. It is a particularly good matchup or answer to the Boros Convoke and Dimir Midrange. Anything that has interesting entered the battlefield effects or activated abilities. And then last, we've got 1 copy of Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal, so you can bump this up to 2 copies. Generally, these are good against like Dimir Midrange and Mono Red, something where you can get to turn 5 and then stabilize off of the lifelink. Third place was taken down by Bant Poison by GCB. And if we compare this, we have to go all the way back to week 9 was the last time we saw the Bant Poison in the top 3. And so if we go back to week 9 of Murders at Karlov Manor, we can see that they've decided to go back kind of to the older version, that so bringing in the 4 copies of the Jawbone Duelist and taking out the Slaughter Singer and the Annex Sentry and the Bloated Contaminator, which was kind of being brought in to answer everybody sideboarding in the temporary lockdowns. And so you'll see that they move them to the sideboard in case, so that they can bring them in if they are up against somebody who's going to bring in the temporary lockdown, which I think is a reasonable way to go about it. So we've also brought in 4 copies of the Aspirant's Ascent, which gives a creature Toxic 1 and +1/+3 and flying for 1 blue. And can kind of help dodge some of the damage-based removal. And then we're bringing in an additional copy of Bring the Ending to a total of 3. Back when I did my sideboard guide for Bant Poison long ago, the Bring the Endings weren't particularly good. I'm curious to see if the meta has shifted where Bring the Ending is looking a little bit more favorable in the data. But we're taking out 1 copy of Serum Snare, and then as far as the lands go, we're bringing in a 4th copy of A Darkar Waste, 3 copies of the new Simic Fastland, the Botanical Sanctum, and deciding to cut a Gonjo in favor of running Otawara, and cutting 2 Razor Verge Thickets, and bringing out the 2 Yavmaya Coasts. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we do see that they brought in the 3 Annex Sentries, so the old one had 1 and now there's 4, so bringing in 3 copies of Annex Sentry to the sideboard from the main, and taking the Doorkeeper Thrall down to 1 copy. This is a pretty good answer to the Boros Convoke because it prevents all of the ETBs from triggering, so your Imidane's Recruiter doesn't do anything. And then as far as, we're cutting 3 copies of the Destroy Evil, so just a single copy of Destroy Evil, cutting 2 copies of Negate, and bringing in and taking out 2 copies of Tokashia's Welcome as well, and then bringing in the 2 copies of the Bloated Contaminator. So you're going to bring in the Annex Sentries and the Bloated Contaminators if you're up against your opponent that has the temporary lockdowns. And then favoring the Spell Pierce instead of the Negates and Disdainful Strokes. And this is a little bit easier to get off if you're, it helps when you have a lower mana count and is cheap to get off for 1 blue. So some people favor the Spell Pierce over Negate, and that's where they decided to go. And then we have another first place for the Standard Challenge 32, and I don't know if this is just going to become the new standard going forward, but we've been seeing basically 2 Standard Challenge 32s on Saturday. So maybe there should just be a different name for the second one or something, but so we've got another one to go through. So first place was taken down by Azorius Control by TCP Gendrick, and Azorius Control is definitely one to keep your eye on because the former world champion, or I guess, no, current world champion, took 2nd place in the Pro Tour with Azorius Control. And there are 3 Azorius Control lists that made it into the top 3 this week. So definitely keep your eye out on this archetype. I do imagine we'll be seeing more of it. And so if we compare this one to the list in the Pro Tour, we can see that they brought in a Tishana's Tidebinder from the sideboard into the main, cut out 2 copies of the March of Otherworldly Light, which is particularly good against the Boros Convoke, being able to block the Gleeful Demolitions, and then took out 1 Phantom Interference and brought in the 4 copies of Deduce, or brought in an additional copy of Deduce to a total of 4, brought in 1 copy of Destroy Evil, cut the 1 copy of Make Disappear, brought in 2 copies of Depopulate, cut 1 Sunfall in favor of Farewell, and this being able to hit exile graveyards lets it be a little bit better against the Temur Control graveyard loop, although sometimes turn 6 is a little bit too slow to have already stopped their loop. So as far as the lands go, we've cut 2 copies of the Darker Waste, which is the Pain Land in Azorius, and cut 1 copy of the Demolition Field and brought in an additional copy of the Field of Ruin to a total of 4. and then brought in an island and cut the 2 copies of Mirrex, so no Mirrex in the list, and instead brought in the Meticulous Archive, which is the Surveil land for Azorius, and brought in 1 Plains and 1 Seachrome Coast, which is the fast land for Azorius, and then cut the 1 Sunken Citadel. So going down in lands from the Pro Tour to a total 27 from 28. And as far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we've got they decided to cut the Boonbringer Valkyrie, and but they did keep the Hullbreaker Horror. They cut 1 copy of Destroy Evil that they moved from the sideboard to the main, and cut 1 Negate, and they brought in and 1 Filigree Silex, which was the artifact that kind of felt a little bit out of place to me, honestly, in the Pro Tour, but was a way of dealing direct damage over time. And then the 2 copies of Unlicensed Hearse, which is good for hating on the graveyard, and this one is going to be leaning a little bit more into so bringing in Dust Animus instead as an alternative threat, and bringing in Rest in Peace, 1 copy here, to instead of the Unlicensed Hearse to answer the Temur Control. And then 2 copies of the Kutzel's Flanker, which also answers, exiles your opponent's graveyard, but is also good to bring in against mono red and can help you stabilize. And exploring 1 copy of Sea Double, and so you choose if an opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard, and this game will go long, right? You may choose both instead. So you get a copy target spell, and then you may choose new targets for the copy, or create a token that's a copy of target creature. So curious to see Sea Double bringing into the list, and if this is here to stay or just being explored. And then also Elish Norn, Mother of Machines, which is particularly good for stopping the Temur Control landfall, because then the triggers don't happen, and same with the Boros Convoke. So Elish Norn we've seen before as a sideboard option. Second place for the Standard Challenge 32 on May 4th was taken down by Gruul Aggro by Dreddy Badges. Totally massacring that one. And so we have to go all the way back to week 4 of Murders of Karlov Manor for a top 3 finish with the Gruul Aggro deck. But it's running, it's taken some changes with Outlaws of Thunder Junction. So we're down the 4 copies of Cacophony Scamp, which is the kind of like cheeky way to get double strike, with the 1/1 that can sacrifice itself to trigger Proliferate and then deals its damage to your opponent. We're down 2 copies of the Felden Ronin Excavator, and leaning into 2 copies of the Picnic Ruiner. And this is one that we've seen kind of come and go. I did one with the Rakdos burn deck that I did for the 50 match summary for best of 1. And Picnic Ruiner can be really fun. The issue is that you have to have the 4 power before attacking. So a lot of times you have to pump this guy's power with something like your Bane Splitter or Monstrous Rage, or something pre-combat, so that it has 4 power, and then which makes it prone to getting 2-for-1 by your opponent's removal. So some people don't like the Picnic Ruiner, some people do. And so this one was bringing in 2 copies there, but then we've got 4 copies of the new Slick Shot Show Off that we got at Outlaws. Is the 1/2 Flying Haste with whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it gets +2/+0, and it has Plot for 1 and a red, so you can set it up to do a whole bunch of stuff. And some decks have been leaning heavily into this to try to get a turn 3 win in best of 1 with the mono red Prowess. So bringing in 4 copies there, and then we're ditching the 2 copies of Case of the Crimson Pulse, which was kind of was in there for more dig, and instead favoring the 2 copies of Snakeskin Veil, which we got back in standard from Outlaws at Thunder Junction. So this way we can protect our threats from removal, which is partly what this deck struggles with, is early interaction. But only running 2 copies because if you have an empty board, it does nothing. And then favoring ditching 2 copies of the Witchstalker Frenzy, so lowering a little bit of the deck's removal capacity, and bringing in 2 copies of Audacity. Audacity works pretty nicely with the Picnic Ruiner, permanently giving it the 4 power, so it will always have double strike. And then when Audacity is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card, which we also see with like the Demonic Ruckus that this list is not running. The enchantments that replace themselves make it a little bit less for a 2-for-1 if your opponent does remove the creature that's enchanted. So I wonder if we're going to see more of that going forward. I hope so. And then as far as the lands go, we've brought in 1 copy of Boseiju Who Endures, and dropped 3 mountains in favor of bringing in 2 Thran portals. So Thran portal being one of those kind of sad necessities if you want to be playing red and green early on in the game. So not ideal, but I'm a fan of Thran portal. Happy to see it. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we've dropped 1 copy of In the Festivities, which is the deck's answer to Boros Convoke, and then dropped 1 copy of the Lithomanic Barrage, which is really great whenever you're up against white or blue, being able to remove something for 1 red. And then we're dropping the 2 copies of the Obliterating Bolt, which is the kind of exile sideboard, and bringing in a 3rd copy of Snakeskin Veil, and 2 Unlicensed Hearse if we need some graveyard hate, and taking the 1 Boseiju out from the sideboard. So the previous list was running a land in the sideboard, which is not uncommon to see in best of 3, where on the play you need more lands than when you're on the draw. So on the play you would bring in your, you would sideboard it in if you wanted to be at 21 lands. So this one is not doing that. And then Witchstalker Frenzy, the last 2 copies of Witchstalker Frenzy here if we need some more removal. All right, we're almost done with May 4th. 3rd place for the Standard Challenge 32 on May 4th. The second one was taken down by Azorius Control by Coluche. And this one, if we compare it to the Pro Tour, did take a slightly different direction. So taking 3 Tishana's Tidebinders into the main, and ditching 1 copy of the Wandering Emperor, as well as 1 copy of March of Otherworldly Light, 1 copy of Phantom Interference, and cutting the 1 Make Disappear, to bring in an additional copy of Temporary Lockdown, up to a total of 3. And then for the lands, we're ditching 1 Field of Ruin, and bringing in an island and a plains, and cutting the Sunken Citadel, which was the one that has the synergies for your man lands and Mirrex and such, because it can tap for 2 mana if it's 4 land ability. And for the best of 3 sideboard, though, we've got the 3 Tishana's Tidebinders have been moved from the sideboard to the main. The Filigree Silex similarly was cut, and the 2 copies of Unlicensed Hearse were also cut, and so was 1 copy of Temporary Lockdown, moved from the sideboard to the main, and bringing in 1 copy of Field of Ruin. Again, this one is okay. There, what did I learn? There we go. Thank you. So Field of Ruin being brought in here for exactly what I was talking about, where on the play you want to bring this in, on the draw you're less hungry for lands. So bringing that one in, probably play versus draw, I would imagine. Also good if you just have additional like man lands that you need to get rid of, right? Bringing in the 2 Rest in Peace instead of the Unlicensed Hearse for the Graveyard Hate against Temur Control, and bringing in 1 Assimilation Aegis, which is a card we got at the Outlaws of Thunder Junction. I think this card kicked my butt in best of 3 playing Domain, because being able to exile something like Atraxa and then be able to turn whatever creature you have into Atraxa can be a pretty good way to make use of those Mirrex tokens and Wandering Emperor tokens and such. So because it's removal, and then you can equip it to a creature to have it turn into a copy of the creature that was exiled by it. So curious to see if we see more of this going forward. And then we've got 1 copy of the Chromho Sea Shark, and this one is really going to be like, Chromho Sea Shark can be good for like Boros Convoke, keeping up with the going wide. It can also be good for if you're coming up against a lot of Wraths, that the Incubator token kind of requires them to wipe the board twice. So some matches are good for bringing in the Chromho Sea Shark. And then we've got 1 copy of the Kutzil's Flanker. So the previous Azorius list was doing 1 Rest in Peace, 2 Flankers. This one's doing 2 Rest in Peace, 1 Flanker. And then the 1 copy of the Wandering Emperor has been moved from the main to the sideboard. All right, on to May 5th. First place for the Standard Challenge 64, which is a bigger tournament, was taken down by Dimir Control by Soggy Cheerios. And for those who were paying very close attention, I post YouTube shorts that kind of, have some music and go over a deck list. And last week I shared Dimir Control from the Pro Tour because I thought it was looking like a particularly interesting archetype. And so happy to see it here in first place. And so we have to go all the way back to week 9 of Murders at Karlov Manor was the last time that I talked about the archetype, and we definitely see a different direction, leaning a little bit more towards the mill plan. So we've dropped the 2 copies of the Chromhost Seed Shark and the 2 copies of Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal, just strictly running a 0 creatures list. And instead, we're bringing in the 2 copies of Jace the Perfected Mind, which used to be in the sideboard, bringing it into the main, and cutting 1 copy of Duress, bringing in an additional copy of Phantom Interference, as well as 4 copies of 3 Steps Ahead, with really leaning into the ability of this to just be a really great tool for control that we got in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. And so we're ditching the Essence Scatter, we're ditching 1 copy of Go for the Throat, and ditching 1 copy of Negate, and bringing in an additional copy of Shieldred's Edict, particularly good against the other control matchups, gives you a little bit of Planeswalker hate, and taking out the 2 Siphon Insights. And then as for the lands, we were taking out an island. We're dropping 1 copy of Mirrex, so a Mirrex list because we're winning through mill, and dropping the Rafine's Tower, and instead bringing up the 4th copy of Restless Reef. Again, this one being able to mill your opponent for 4 cards every time that you attack with the man land. And then we're bringing in 2 copies of the Sunken Citadel to really help us activate our Field of Ruins and our Restless Reefs, and bringing in 1 copy of the Underground River. And then as far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we've got the one additional copy of the Tishana's Tidebinder. Again, good against the decks that have good ETBs. It's very, Tishana's Tidebinder also works for silencing Planeswalkers, silencing Atraxa in Domain. There's a lot of really good targets for Tishana's Tidebinder. And so we're bringing in 1 of those. We're taking out the Urtai Resurrected and bringing the Duress from the main into the sideboard, and dropping 2 copies of the Parasitic Grasp and the 2 copies of Malicious Eclipse, and the 2 copies of Jace have been moved to the main, and bringing in 2 copies of the Unlicensed Hearse, and the 1 copy of Path of Peril. So Malicious Eclipse kind of exiling everything by giving everything -2/-2. This one just straight up destroying all creatures with mana value 2 or less, because you won't be able to cleave it with white. And 1 copy of Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal, for if we really do need at least 1 creature threat to win the game. And this, again, is good stabilization because of the lifelink. Second place was taken down by Azorius Control by Gracias Portanto, a classic top 3 in the Standard Challenge pilot. And we're going to skip that one, though, because it was basically the same list that TCP Gendrick did that we already covered, except for the best of 3 sideboard change. They decided to bring in 1 more Rest in Peace instead of the C double. So Azorius Control really looking strong this week. As I mentioned, 3 top 3 finishes. So 3rd place for the Standard Challenge 64 on May 5th was taken down by Golgari Midrange by Tulio Jodi. And we haven't seen Golgari Midrange in the top 3 for a little bit, so I have to go all the way back to week 6 of Murders of Karlov Manor. But we see a dramatic rework of the archetype, almost so much that it's not even really comparable to the previous Golgari Midrange. So we're dropping the 4 copies of Deep Cavern Bat, the 4 copies of Mosswood Dreadknight, the Glissa Sunslayer, the 4 copies of Preacher of the Schism, 3 copies of Sentinel of the Nameless City, 2 copies of Tranquil Frillback, and instead we're bringing in 4 copies of the Free Strider Lookout, which was a new rare that we got in Outlaws, a 3/3 reach that whenever you commit a crime, you look at the top 5 cards of your library and put a land onto the battlefield tapped. And this triggers only once each turn, but helps you ramp into additional threats, as well as stabilize in the air. And bringing in 2 copies of the Graveyard Trespasser, which we have seen this one before. And the Golgari Midrange that I explored for my best 150 match summary had Graveyard Trespasser. And I like the ability to have a creature that also hates on the graveyard in the current meta. There's enough going on with Graveyard Reanimation. It's nice to have the removal. But bringing in 2 copies of Kervik, the Punisher, which allows us to exile a black card from our graveyard and cast it, not for free, but can cast it again. And if you do, you lose 2 life, and that triggers every time that you commit a crime. Bringing in 2 copies of the Hostile Investigator, which is kind of a 3-for-1 because you get a clue token every time that your opponent discards, and so you can also get that off of Duress. And it makes them discard and then creates the clue token, which helps you then draw. So really curious to see just kind of, the reason why it's like classic Golgari midrange is that you're trying to outvalue your opponent, and Hostile Investigator is pretty good. 3-for-1s are how you outvalue your opponent for sure. We're taking out the 1 Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal and running Gisa, the Hellraiser, as the top end. And this one I've covered before. It's every time that you commit a crime, you get 2 3/3 zombie menace creature tokens. Technically they're 2/2s, but Gisa pumps them up into 3/3s and gives them menace. And you can do this multiple, like you can do this once each turn, including your opponent's turn. So Gisa the Hellraiser can just pump out a ton of zombie creature tokens. And then we're cutting the Planeswalker suite, so we're ditching the Liliana the Veil, the Nissa, Ascended Animist, and we're also cutting 1 copy of Cutdown and bringing in 2 copies of Duress. And as I've mentioned before, I do think that Duress is main boardable in this meta. There's very little, especially in best of 3, that is running a list where the Duress is not going to have a good target. We're bringing in 1 copy of March of Wretched Sorrow to give us a little bit of that lifelink. Can be helpful, handy against mono red. And then 2 copies of Long Goodbye. And 1 copy of the Outrageous Robbery, which gives us an alternative, against the Temur Control, which is really good at thinning their own deck. Outrageous Robbery can be a win con in and of itself, but also just gives us good dig and gives us alternative threats if we are trying to outvalue our opponent. And then we're bringing in 2 copies of the Urgent Necropsy, which you get to destroy up to 1 target artifact, creature, enchantment, and planeswalker, where their total mana value is equal to the amount of evidence that you collected. So that was something that we saw in Murders at Karlov Manor. And to collect evidence, you exile cards from your graveyard, and then the mana value X of the cards that you exiled allows you to destroy lots of things with a single card. So curious to see how this one will be, since there's not a whole lot in this deck that's just naturally, there's not a lot of mill that's naturally filling our graveyard. So curious to see how Urgent Necropsy actually plays out. And then 2 copies of Cease and Desist, which gives you some of that graveyard hate, as well as being able to destroy all artifacts and enchantments. Most of the time you're just casting this for the 1 black or green and exiling things to gain some life and drawing a card. So I've been happy with Cease and Desist. I think it's one of those cards that's a little bit undervalued. So I was happy to see it here. And then we're dropping the 3 copies of Gix's Command and instead bringing in the Tiny Bones Joins Up. And this one is like the crime enabler for your legendaries, triggering crimes when they enter by milling your opponent and losing a life. And then we've also got 2 copies of Spelunking. So as we see this, as time goes on, we're going to see a lot of fine tuning to this archetype, I imagine. Because there's a lot of 2-ofs that could probably be, like, something could be cut, and where, I'm really curious to see where this goes, because this is definitely not the final version. And so Spelunking allowing us to have our lands that normally would enter tapped not enter tapped. And then as far as the lands go, we're dropping Boseiju, and we're bringing in a Demolition Field and a Field of Ruin for a little bit of hate, manland hate, which I thought was kind of weird, because usually you see this more in control lists than you do in actual midrange. And bringing in 2 copies of Mirix, which makes sense, and then dropping the 5 copies of the Forests and the 4 copies of the Llanowar Wastes, which is the Golgari Painland, and bringing in 4 copies of the Sunken Citadel to really lean into activating our Mirix and our Restless Cottage. And then we're dropping a Swamp, the 2 copies of the Underground Mortuary, which was the Surveil land, which would help us get evidence for Urgent Necropsy. And then bringing in the Dross Pits, which I haven't seen. Like, Phyrexia all will be 1. It's a tap land that taps for black, and then you can sacrifice it to draw a card. So again, like I said, I don't think that this is an optimized list, and I'm really curious to see where this goes. But a top 3 finish in the standard challenge means that it's doing something right, for sure. And so we see an additional copy of Cutdown in the sideboard. We see 2 less copies of Duress, and 2 additional copies of Unlicensed Hearse, again to hate on the graveyard. An additional copy of... down 1 copy of Long Goodbye, and instead bringing in the Blot Out, which, like I mentioned, is particularly good at getting rid of Aclazotz because it exiles, and Aclazotz is a sticky threat that is a high mana value. And then bringing in an additional an additional copy of Path of Peril, so a total of 4, and to really hate on Temur Control, on Boros Convoke. Back whenever I rewatch these videos, it's always funny to catch it when I say something wrong and I don't catch it. So I try to do my best, though. Bear with me. And then it's a lot, dropping 1 copy of Terra Sunder, which was the artifact and enchantment hate that you can kick to exile non-land permanent, and bringing in 2 copies of Gix's Command. Again, this is helpful against the Boros Convoke strategy. The versatility of Gix's Command is quite impressive. Being able to give yourself lifelink, being able to wrath your board, or being able to just outvalue your opponent by bringing stuff back from the graveyard. And then Cruelty of Gix, bringing us the you get a hate on your opponent's hand, then you get to search your library for a card and pay 3 life, and then the third chapter is you get to put a creature card from your graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. And it doesn't have to be your graveyard, it can be any graveyard, it can be your opponent's creature. Notably, though, that there can be problems with choosing your opponent's creature. Like if they bounce it, it goes back to their hand, and then they can play it. And the Cruelty of Gix, though, you can also do the read ahead, so you can choose which which chapter you want to bring it in on. And then ditching the Planeswalker suite that we saw being explored in Murders of Carlock Manor. So dropping the 1 copy of Liliana of the Veil, Nissa Ascended Animist, and Sorin the Mirthless from the sideboard as well. So no Planeswalkers. All right, and that's it for best of 3. If you're a best of 1 guy, don't worry, I cover best of 1 as well. And so what I like to do is I like to look at Untapped, which is a Magic the Gathering tracker. And kind of that way I can remove the bias of saying what is the best of 1 deck, right? And so this week, Mono White Humans was the number 1 position on Untapped. And if we compare it to week 2 of Outlaws with Thunder Junction, the list has a few changes, not a whole lot. So we're dropping the 1 copy of Recruitment Officer, bringing in 2 copies of the Voice of the Blessed, which I think is kind of fun. Like if we're going to run the Intrepid Adversaries, which have lifelink, and the Lunarch Veterans that trigger 1 life gain every time that something enters the battlefield, coming off of like the tokens from Adeline, the tokens from Sanguine Evangelist. If we're going to be running that kind of life gain suite against mono red, then Voice of the Blessed might actually be pretty good. I played about an hour with this deck, so like 20 matches or so, and it did really well. It was definitely I can see why it's a number 1, because it just like the Thalia 2 and the Coppercroat Vanguard naturally disrupts a lot of the interaction that is being brought in to disrupt mono red Prowess, which is weak to interaction, and so you're kind of punishing those decks. And then the increasing the spells cost 1 more also counters the Prowess the Prowess deck as well as the life gain. So it's just really well positioned in the meta. And I've been a big fan of mono white humans. It's not a new list really, nothing really new. Although the Voice of the Blessed we don't usually see that one. So kind of a new inclusion there. Dropping 1 copy of Adeline, Resplendent Cathar. That one we've seen before kind of fluctuate between 3 and 4 copies. And then bringing in a full 4 Cavern of Souls and bringing out 1 Plains. And I think this really just says that like there's been more control on the ladder. Last week when I did my 50 match summary, it felt like 4 copies of Cavern of Souls was worth running, especially in a list that is primarily entirely human. You do have the Vampire on Sanguine Evangelist and the Voice of the Blessed as a cleric, but you can also play your Lunarch Veteran off of naming cleric. But yeah, if you haven't checked it out, definitely do so. It's a pretty good way to climb best of 1. Next up, we've got Boros Convoke, which is number 2 according to Untapped. And if we compare this one to week 2 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, we can see that we've brought in 2 additional copies of the Ocean Frontliner and dropped 1 copy of the Sanguine Evangelist and 2 copies of the Case of the Gateway Express to bring in 2 copies of Warleader's Call. And usually we see kind of one or the other. So this one favoring kind of a 2-2 split, which again, I think points to there being this kind of division between some people running the mono red Prowess deck and the mono red aggro deck that we usually see, and then more control coming into the meta, because War Leader's Call is better against the more grindy matchups, and but it doesn't develop the board, right? So interesting to see this kind of, like, my speculations on the meta are reflected in the deck's changes this week. And then the Agonjo Seat of the Empire were just down 1 copy here. Last week there were 2 copies, and again, this can be a little bit unfortunate when you're up against something that doesn't have any creatures, and then you have a legendary land in play, and you can't play this from your hand. So having 2 copies of the legendary lands can be awkward. And then we've also dropped the 1 copy of Mirix, and brought in 2 copies of the mountains and 3 copies of the plains, because we are ditching the Sundown Pass and the Thran portals and running 21 land instead of 22. So getting rid of the Mirix, because we really need to make sure that each one of our 21 lands count. Number 3 was Mono Red Prowess, and if we compare this one to week 2 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, we can see a pretty small change. So we're dropping 2 copies of the Demonic Ruckus, and bringing in 3 mountains, and cutting the 1 copy of Sokenzan Crucible of Defiance. And honestly, I don't understand why that would be cut. It does feel like it's free to play. Maybe it's because of non-basic like land hate somehow, but I doubt it, right? So, but 20 lands instead of 18. So last week's list was really cheesing, really leaning on to the best one hand smoother, and taking advantage of the very low-costed list. So now we kind of see 20 lands, and this one's going to give you a little bit more consistency. I think in the long run, this is probably going to be better than the 18 lands. And then Demonic Ruckus, obviously, can be awkward when you aren't hitting into your creatures, which is something that this deck kind of deals with. Is do you have all of your combat tricks and no creatures, right? So I think this is leaning a little bit more towards a consistent strategy over the miracle turn 3 best the deck can be, which I think is where the 18 lands leans a little bit more. Number 4 was Mono Red Aggro, and if we compare this one to week 2, we can see that the 3 copies of the Bloodthirsty Adversary have been cut to bring in an additional copy of the Charming Scoundrel and the 2 copies of the Fugitive Codebreaker, which, if I remember correctly, was the same list as the week before it. So we're kind of seeing a back and forth between the 2 lists. This week, it's the 1 copy of Bloodthirsty Adversary deck that that took the number 1 spot for Mono Red Aggro. And we can see that they ditched the Sokenzan Crucible of Defiance in this one as well. Again, that usually synergizes with Godric Cloaked Reveler. So I would probably bring in 1 over a mountain. And but this list decided to bring in 20 lands just straight up. So curious to see if we see Sokenzan come back in the following weeks. Number 5 was Rakdos Burn, and it was the exact same list as week 2, so we're going to skip that one, and you can always go look at the video from last week if you really want the list, or from my best of my 50 match summary from 2 weeks ago, I think, was Rakdos Burn. Temur Control snuck up into the top 8 this week, and so the last time that we saw Temur Control in the top 8 was all the way back in week 9 of Murders of Carla Manor, and this is what saying with kind of feeling like Control is making its way back into more and more of the best of 1 meta. And so this list, compared to the week 9, has ditched the 3 copies of Philagi Archaeologist, which was the 0/3 blue creature that mills and looks for spells, particularly good at stabilizing or helping not just completely get run over by mono red, and dropped 1 copy of Shigeki Jukaya Visionary, and dropped 1 Doppelgang, which was an alternative win condition to World Soul's Rage. Dropped World Soul's Rage down to 3 copies from 4, and then we have seen that before in best of 3 as well as in best of 1. And then I kind of like having 4 though, because a lot of times you use the first World Soul's Rage to ramp and start your loop. And so having only 3 copies makes that a little bit more of a dangerous ask, especially since we're dropping a Shigeki, which is our way of getting back the World Soul's Rage. So dropping the Vampire's Vengeance, which was a good answer for Boros Convoke, and instead leaning more heavily, like 4 copies of Virtue of Strength, really just trying to hit into our top end, win in 1 turn kind of combo. And then the 3 copies of Fires of Victory that we saw at the Pro Tour, making its way into the best of 1 lists. And so this one dealing damage equal to creature or planeswalker equal to the number of cards in your hand, and if you kick it, it also draws. And we've got 3 copies of Spelunking, which allows us so that when we're doing the sacrifice loop of the lands, they come into play untapped. So the lands that like this fetches don't enter the battlefield tapped with Spelunking, which allows us to do really cool stuff with the Nissa loop. So Spelunking enabling some pretty silly turns in this deck. So seeing 3 copies that weren't being run in Murders of Carlisle Manor, and then dropping a mountain in favor of 1 Riveteer's Overlook. Number 7 was the 4-color Reanimator deck. And this is one that I covered back in week 1 for my Meta Breakers, where I look at off-meta picks every Sunday. And so this one, I originally saw this list by MTG Creative Combos, who's a fellow Magic the Gathering content creator, and has been coming up with some really cool stuff for for the set. And so I saw this list, and it picked up in popularity, and now it made it into the top 8. And we do see some changes from the so the original list, I think, was running like Ledger Shredder and the Chart a Course, and was leaning more heavily into enabling the combo. And so we've seen it kind of optimized from there. And during the week 1 meta breaker, I believe there were 4 copies of Knockout Blow, and those have been ditched. And instead we're bringing in 2 copies of the Sunset Revelry, which again, like Knockout Blow, Sunset Revelry, both are really good against stabilizing against mono red. This deck can get the infinite damage combo off as early as turn 4, but yeah, you can also get completely pressured out, right? So your weakest matchups are going to be against the more aggressive strategies. So Sunset Revelry helps slow that down. And same thing with Temporary Lockdown. Being able to just kind of, slow our opponent's strategy down, give us time to hit the combo. And similarly, and this one I thought we should have had from the beginning. I can't believe it wasn't included. Ditching 2 islands and 2 planes to bring in Meticulous Archive, which helps us surveil and put stuff into our graveyard so that we can hit the combo. Because you need to get stuff into the graveyard for your combo to work. If you don't have any idea what I'm talking about right now, and you don't know what the combo is, really quickly, it's centered around these 3 cards. So Rakdos Joins Up. Whenever a legendary creature controlled dies, it deals damage equal to the controller's power to target opponent, and you're going to reanimate a Rakdos Joins Up with Abuelo's Awakening. You don't X equals 0 is fine, makes this into a 1/1. And then when this enters the battlefield, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with 2 additional +1/+1 counters on it. So when this enters the battlefield, you bring back a Hulking Metamorph from your graveyard. Comes in as a 7/7, gets pumped to a 9/9. You have Hulking Metamorph copy Rakdos Joins Up, which is a 1/1 creature right now, legendary. And because of the legendary rule, you send 1 to your graveyard, send the Hulking Metamorph to the graveyard, it deals 9 damage to your opponent. It then triggers on the ETB, though, bringing a card back from the battlefield, and so you choose the Hulking Metamorph, and you just loop every single time, dealing 18 damage, because both of these trigger for 9 damage to your opponent. So you don't have to do it like 1,000 clicks, which is nice when I like the combos that don't, like, the combo decks we've seen for infinite damage in the past required a lot of clicking. And so better in paper than on Arena. And this one's pretty Arena friendly. So. All right, once again, 15 decks in under an hour. Let's go. So number 8 was Azorius Control. And if we compare this one to week 2, we can see that they've brought in 4 copies of the Kutzel's Flanker. And this is really just to answer Temur Control, and again, to help stabilize against mono red. And so we're dropping 2 copies of Sunfall, running a single copy there, and bringing in 1 copy of Farewell, bringing out the 1 copy of Negate, and the 3 copies of Soul Partition, and the 1 copy of Sunset Revelry, as well as 1 copy of the Celestis, so down to a single copy there, and favoring the Get Lost for Creature, Enchantment, and Planeswalker Hate. And as far as the lands go, we're down 3 copies of the Adarkar Waste, and down 4 demolition fields, so leaning more heavily into the Field of Ruin, and bringing in 2 more copies of Agonjo, Seat of the Empire, so a total of 3, which usually you see this kind of cap off around 2, but if you are bumping into a lot of creature decks, then this gives you a lot of pointed removal in your lands. We're dropping 2 islands and the 1 copy of Mirrex, so no Mirrex in this list, and bringing in the 4 copies of the Meticulous Archive to help us surveil into our threats and the cards that we want to draw, and 3 copies, bringing in 3 copies of Seachrome Coast, which is the Azorius Fastland, and bringing in the 3 copies of Field of Ruin instead of Demolition Field, which are largely the same. They're just non-basic or manland hate. So with that, though, that's going to do it for me. Thanks for joining me. If this is your jam, I do one of these every Monday, so remember to click like and subscribe. It's the best way to help support me. And then thank you to those who can help support me financially and who choose to do so by clicking join as a YouTube member, and or subscribing on my Twitch, or donating through Patreon. So thank you everybody for the support. Good luck crushing the your matches and climbing the best of 1 ladder or the best of 3 ladder. And I will see you all next Monday for another meta review. Take care, everybody.